So we'll begin with the first of these 4 points, and I'll just run through those 4 points, and hopefully we'll allow plenty of time for questions and answers, because I realize this is a little bit controversial. And so I would welcome your questions even as we go along if something seems particularly out of rhyme with what we're trying to do. First point, and we'll have 4 points. There are comparable international tensions between these 2 years. However, there's the black box phenomenon. We really don't know what Beijing is thinking these days. I think the students would like to know, who are in the streets. But we certainly don't know what Obama's thinking either, although I can well imagine he's looking at the election results, which are now coming in. It has not been good in the United States. Well, now didn't that show my bias? It is certainly not good for Obama. And the next 2 years are going to be very, very difficult in American politics. But that's a black box. We can't know precisely what will happen. But we do know that there are 4 areas of comparability in these tensions, 1914 to 2014. First of all, there's conflict over insignificant possessions, insignificant territories. Spend a little bit of time with this slide. It's the case that in 1914, indeed, in the 20 years prior to 1914, this little part of Europe was subject to great power manipulation. And the manipulation was nasty. There were 2 wars fought in these Balkans in 1912 and 1913. Monica and I just did a tour of this region. And the war is not over in this region. World War II is not over. The same ethnic tensions that riled the world in 1914 are doing the same thing today. So, in 1914, there emerged a triple entente, France, UK, and Russia, joined together to try to control what was going on in these little countries, particularly in Serbia. And you'll recognize that Serbia is still a difficult place. Against that triple entente was the Triple Alliance: Germany, Austria, Hungary, and Italy. Italy not so much a big help to these. Germany clearly the greatest power. What they were trying to do was to control the Balkans. And it really was the case that Germany was more concerned about the United Kingdom, more concerned about Britain, than it was concerned about anything down here. Nonetheless, Austria-Hungary was its ally, and Austria-Hungary had a big issue with Serbia. And that resulted in the assassination of the Archduke Franz Ferdinand, who was the heir apparent to the Austro-Hungarian throne. This was the cause of the war, the immediate cause, but by no means the longer-term cause. Let's look at the next slide. Uh-oh. There it is. You're familiar with this. This is the South China Sea. This is the area of concern right now, which reminds me a little bit and resonates with me as similar to 1914. It's the 9-dash line. The 9-dash line has a checkered history. It has become very important to the People's Republic of China. It is like this, right here, right here, right here, and going up this way. It appeared initially in 1947 when Chiang Kai-shek's government issued this as a statement of what Chinese control should be. Now, actually, there were earlier versions of it, but in 1947, it was Chiang's government. Now, 2 years ago, the mainland Chinese government began to imprint their passports with the 9-dash line. So it becomes a very important statement of Chinese interest in controlling these island chains, the Paracels, the Spratlys. Up here you have other island chains, and off the Philippines you can't read it, but that is the Scarborough Shoals. And throughout this area, there's concern that China would exert fundamental control over these areas, and that would be inimical to the interests of Japan and the U.S. itself, because this is a huge transit zone for 40% of the world's commerce runs through this area. The Southeast Asian nations, Vietnam, Philippines particularly, are not happy with this. What's at stake here is who will control the East and South China Seas, and who will set the conditions of that control. The United States would like to say that this is an international waterway and the rule of law should operate. And the Chinese are saying, well, what about the Caribbean Sea? You, after all, have exerted this same control. Why is it that we can't exert control over that? This is a very good question. And the United States needs to pay attention to that question. As a good friend of mine said yesterday to me, you know, I would not normally say this about the U.S., but the U.S. needs to look more inward these days and to ask itself very big questions about what its role is going to be. Well, that's the conflict over seemingly insignificant territories. These are just hunks of rock for the most part. These island chains, not very heavily populated. And up in the East China Sea, of course, we're looking at real chunks of rock in the Diaoyu and Senkaku Islands. Second area of comparability in international tensions, and I'll hurry now. Are you still with me? Am I losing you? Okay. The naval arms race. It's a very big race these days, and I think you're aware of this. Where'd that come from? There's a book that was published in 1890 by Alfred Thayer Mahan called The Influence of Sea Power Upon History. He was an American admiral. And that book set the stage for the horrendous naval rivalry. It's really an arms race that went on between 1890 and, well, throughout most of the 20th century. That book is one of the most translated books in China now and is read by countless Chinese. The Influence of Sea Power Upon History. What Mahan said was, whoever has the predominant navy controls the world. Well, the U.S. has the predominant navy, for now. But what are the Chinese doing? The Chinese are building a blue water navy. And that navy already operates in the blue waters of the Indian Ocean against terrorism there by the Somali pirates. It's very important that the Chinese are there and cooperating with the other naval powers. Germany against Britain in 1914 focused around one thing. Who's going to have the most battleships? Back then, a battleship was worth something. Today, battleships not worth anything. They really are out of fashion, and they can't compete with carriers and missiles and so on. Not so in 1914. And so the Germans built as many battleships as they could in order to take on Britain's battleships. They lost that. Britain in 1914 had 20 battleships, and the Germans had only 14, a significant deficit. The Germans, however, built the Kiel Canal, so they could take their dreadnoughts from the North Sea to the Baltic Sea and back and forth. So Germany was doing things to challenge British sea power. China versus the U.S., 1914, maybe that's too strong, but China's relationship to the U.S. is reflecting this kind of naval arms race. So the Liaoning, China's first aircraft carrier, and it's really only a trainer, it's not a combat craft, but if you were to read American popular media, you would think that this was the equivalent of any American carrier, and it's not. It's a trainer, but it is a carrier. And that is a symbolic statement about where we're going with the naval arms race. What are the U.S. doing? The U.S. launched on October 25th the newest of its Virginia-class submarines, and that makes 11 or 12 Virginia-class submarines. The United States is not sitting on its hands. So it's worrisome. You had the naval arms race in 1914. You have a beginning naval arms race right now. Third thing that reminds me of that 1914 in 2014, is nationalism, a sharp increase in nationalism. And it's not just in China, it's all over the world. It certainly is in these Baltic states, Balkan states right now. And it's in the United States as well. The United States has a sort of wounded bear mentality right now, trying to do things in Iraq and Afghanistan, even other places in the Middle East, which it can't really do. And so there's a feeling of nationalism. Why do we bother? What should we do about this? There's also a fear of appearing weak. And so President Obama is constantly assailed in the American press for being a weak president, when in fact what he's trying to do is withdraw the United States from impossible situations. But the conversation in the United States is intensely nationalistic. The same thing is true today when China has a training carrier. That's all. But of course China could build and will build on the basis of that, and will build the aircraft carriers if they see it fit. What do the Japanese think of that? Scares them to death. And so Shinzo Abe, the premier, wants to undo Article 9 of the Japanese Constitution, which the Americans put in place in 1952, which outlaws war as an instrument of policy, at least aggressive war. You can have self-defense forces in Japan, but not offensive forces. Always wondered, what difference? Which way is the gun pointing, I guess? Yeah, I guess a gun can be offensive or not, and so can ships. In Vietnam and the Philippines, there's worry. There's considerable worry about what China is doing, and so nationalism is arising. You recall what happened last summer when China placed its billion-dollar drilling platform in an area, the South China Sea, which the Vietnamese claim is theirs. And that led to some horrible riots in Vietnam. So I could belabor this. I shall not do it. One quote from President Obama, April 24, 2004, in Tokyo. He said in a speech, "Let me reiterate that our treaty commitment to Japan's security is absolute, and Article 5 covers all territories under Japan's administration, including the Senkaku Islands," the Diaoyu. That is a pretty strong statement of nationalism and support for the Japanese government in its disagreements with China. Fourth thing I would say, and these are still the resonances between these 2 years, there is the emergence now of assertive new leaders, especially in China, who seek to change the international rules of commerce, and perhaps more than that. There's a resonance with Kaiser Wilhelm II. Wilhelm ruled Germany from 1888 to 1918. He was a war minister, if you will, even though he controlled the government. His intention was to take on Germany, take on Britain, and to knock Britain off its perch. He was reckless, and it's in his hands that the cause of World War I rests. Now, Xi Jinping took office 2 years ago. My attitude towards Xi Jinping is give the man a break. Give him time. He's 2 years in office. He has 10 years total. He has been pretty assertive, all right, in his actions in the South China Sea especially, but in the East China Sea with the Senkaku Diaoyu Islands. But it's not clear at this point. We can't see through that black box to see what Xi Jinping really has in mind. He has, however, concentrated enormous power in his hands. He's the paramount leader now, as Deng Xiaoping was, but no one since that time was as paramount, if that's a way to put it, as Xi Jinping. So some analysts are looking at Kaiser Wilhelm II and comparing his activities with what Xi Jinping is doing now in the South China Sea. For me, that's a stretch, and I'll say it again. Let's let Xi Jinping have some time to settle his government. Okay. Now, this is a lot already. I could stop here and just quit. Do you have questions you'd like to raise at this point? Or shall I go on and just finish up what I have prepared? Please go on. If the political scientist says I can do that when I'm traipsing all over your territory, I'll do that.